Oxford Bookworms, Stage 5. David Copperfield, by Charles Dickens. Retold by Claire West. Read by Andrew Burt. Published and copyright Oxford University Press, 1997. Chapter 1. David Copperfield's Childhood. I was born at Blunderstone, in Suffolk, in the east of England, and was given my poor father's name, David Copperfield. Sadly, he never saw me. He was much older than my mother when they married, and died 6 months before I was born. My father's death made my beautiful young mother very unhappy, and she knew she would find life extremely difficult with a new baby and no husband. The richest and most important person in our family was my father's aunt, Miss Betsey Trotwood. She had in fact been married once to a handsome young husband, but because he demanded money from her, and sometimes beat her, she decided they should separate. He went abroad, and soon news came of his death. Miss Trotwood bought a small house by the sea, and lived there alone, with only one servant. She had not spoken to my father since his marriage, because she considered he had made a mistake in marrying a very young girl. But just before I was born, when she heard that my mother was expecting a baby, she came to visit Blunderstone. It was a cold, windy Friday afternoon in March. My mother was sitting by the fire, feeling very lonely and unhappy, and crying a little. Suddenly, a stern, strange-looking face appeared at the window. "Open the door!" ordered the stern-faced lady. My mother was shocked, but obeyed at once. "You must be David Copperfield's wife," said the lady as she entered. "I'm Betsey Trotwood. You've heard of me?" "Yes," whispered my mother, trembling. "How young you are!" cried Miss Betsey. "Just a baby!" My mother started sobbing again. "I know I look like a child. I know I was young to be a wife, and I'm young to be a mother. But perhaps I'll die before I become a mother." "Come, come," answered Miss Betsey. "Have some tea. Then you'll feel better. What do you call your girl?" "My girl? I don't know yet that it will be a girl," replied my mother miserably. "No, I don't mean the baby. I mean your servant." "Oh, her name's Peggotty. Her first name's Clara, the same as mine, so I call her by her family name, you see." "What a terrible name! However, never mind. Peggotty," she called, going to the door, "bring Mrs. Copperfield some tea at once." She sat down again and continued speaking. "You were talking about the baby. I'm sure it'll be a girl. Now, as soon as she's born—" "He, perhaps," said my mother bravely. "Don't be stupid. Of course it'll be a she. I'm going to send her to school and educate her well. I want to prevent her from making the mistakes I've made in life." Miss Betsey looked quite angry as she said this. My mother said nothing, as she was not feeling at all well. "But tell me, were you and your husband happy?" asked Miss Betsey. This made my poor mother feel worse than ever. "I know I wasn't very sensible about money or cooking or things like that," she sobbed. "But we loved each other, and he was helping me to learn. And then he died. Oh, oh!" And she fell back in her chair, completely unconscious. Peggotty, who came in just then with the tea, realised how serious the situation was, and took my mother upstairs to bed. The doctor arrived soon afterwards, and stayed all evening to take care of his patient. At about midnight he came downstairs to the sitting-room, where Miss Betsey was waiting impatiently. "Well, doctor, what's the news? How is she?" "The young mother is quite comfortable, madam," replied the doctor politely. "But she, the baby, how is she?" cried Miss Betsey. The doctor looked strangely at Miss Betsey. "It's a boy, madam," he replied. Miss Betsey said nothing, but walked straight out of the house, and never came back. That was how I was born. My early childhood was extremely happy, as my beautiful mother and kind Peggotty took care of me. But when I was about 8, a shadow passed over my happiness. My mother often went out walking in her best clothes with a gentleman called Mr. Murdstone. He had black hair, a big black moustache, and an unpleasant smile, and seemed to be very fond of my mother. But I knew that Peggotty did not like him. A few months later, Peggotty told me that my mother was going to have a short holiday with some friends. Meanwhile, Peggotty and I would go to stay with her brother Daniel in Yarmouth, on the east coast, for 2 weeks. I was very excited when we climbed into the cart, although it was sad saying good-bye to my mother. Mr. Murdstone was at her shoulder, waving good-bye, as the driver called to his horse, and we drove out of the village. When we got down from the cart in Yarmouth after our journey, Peggotty said, "That's the house, Master David." I looked all round, but could only see an old ship on the sand. "Is that your brother's house?" I asked in delight. And when we reached it, I saw it had doors and windows and a chimney just like a real house. I could not imagine a nicer place to live. Everything was clean and tidy, and smelt of fish. Now I was introduced to the Peggotty family. There was Daniel Peggotty, a kind old sailor. Although he was not married, he had adopted 2 orphans, who lived with him and called him Uncle. Ham Peggotty was a large young man with a gentle smile, and Emily was a beautiful blue-eyed little girl. They all welcomed Peggotty and me warmly. I spent a wonderfully happy 2 weeks there, playing all day on the beach with Emily, and sleeping in my own little bed on the ship. I'm sure I was in love with little Emily in my childish way, and I cried bitterly when we had to say good-bye at the end of the holiday. But on the way home to Blunderstone, Peggotty looked at me very worriedly. "Master David, my dear," she said suddenly in a trembling voice, "I must tell you. You'll have to know now. While we've been away, your dear mother has married Mr. Murdstone. He's your stepfather now." I was deeply shocked. I could not understand how my mother could have married that man. And when we arrived home, I could not help showing my mother how very miserable I was. I went straight to my room and lay sobbing on my bed, which made my poor mother very unhappy too. As she sat beside me, holding my hand, Mr. Murdstone suddenly came in. "What's this, Clara, my love?" he asked sternly. "Remember, you must be firm with the boy. I've told you before. You're too weak with him." "Oh, yes, Edward. I'm afraid you're right," my mother replied quickly. "I'm very sorry. I'll try to be firmer with him." And when she left the room, Mr. Murdstone whispered angrily to me, "David, do you know what I'll do if you don't obey me? I'll beat you like a dog." I was still very young, and I was very frightened of him. If he had said one kind word to me, perhaps I would have liked and trusted him, and my life would have been different. Instead, I hated him for the influence he had over my dear mother, who wanted to be kind to me, but also wanted to please her new husband. That evening, Mr. Murdstone's sister arrived to help my mother in the house. A tall, dark lady, with a stern, frowning face. She looked and sounded very much like her brother. I thought she was planning to stay with us for a long time, and I was right. In fact, she intended to stay forever. She started work the next morning. "Now, Clara," she said firmly to my mother at breakfast, I'm here to help you. You're much too pretty and thoughtless to worry about the servants, the food, and so on. So just hand me your keys to all the cupboards, and I'll take care of everything for you." My poor mother just blushed, looked a little ashamed, and obeyed. From then on, Miss Murdstone took complete control of the house, keeping the keys hanging from her waist as she hurried through the house, checking that everything was being done just as she wished. Chapter 2. David is sent away to school. I was very unhappy during this time. Mr. Murdstone insisted on my studying, and so my mother gave me lessons. In the past, she and I had enjoyed our studies together, and she had taught me a lot in her gentle way. But now, both Mr. and Miss Murdstone were present during my lessons, and somehow I could not concentrate or remember what I had learnt. My poor mother was very sympathetic and tried to encourage me, sometimes even whispering the answer to me. But the Murdstones had sharp ears. "Clara, my love," Mr. Murdstone used to say crossly, "remember, be firm. You're making the boy's character worse by helping him like that." "Oh, Edward, I'm sorry," my mother replied, looking embarrassed, and hanging her head like a guilty child. One morning, when I arrived in the sitting-room as usual for my lesson, I saw that Mr. Murdstone had a thin stick in his hand. I could not take my eyes off it. "You must be very careful today, David," he said with his unpleasant smile, holding the stick in both hands. I knew what would happen then. A terrible fear took hold of me, and all that I had learnt disappeared immediately from my memory, so that I could not answer any of my mother's questions. Mr. Murdstone got up from his chair. "Well, David," he said heavily, "I think you've worried your mother enough today. We'll go upstairs, boy. Come." And he picked up the stick. I heard my mother crying as we went upstairs. "Please, Mr. Murdstone," I cried, "don't beat me. I've tried to learn, really I have, sir." But he did not listen to me. In my bedroom, he held my arms and started hitting me with the stick. I managed to get hold of his hand and bit deep into it. He cried out angrily and began to hit me as hard as he could. Above the noise of my screams, I could hear my mother and Peggotty crying outside the door. Then, the next moment, he was gone. I heard him lock the door, and I was lying, sore and bleeding, on the floor. The whole house seemed suddenly very quiet. I stayed there for a time, without moving. In the evening, Miss Murdstone brought me some bread and milk, which she left on the floor beside me, frowning angrily at me as she went out. I was kept locked in that room for 5 days and nights, and saw nobody except Miss Murdstone, who brought me food, but never spoke to me. To a small boy, the 5 days seemed like years, and I can still remember how frightened and guilty I felt. But during the 5th night, I heard a strange noise at the keyhole. It was Peggotty, trying to give me a message. "Master David, my dear," she whispered, sobbing, They're going to send you away to boarding school. Tomorrow." "Oh, Peggotty," I cried. "Then I won't see you and Mother very often." "No, my love. But don't forget, I'll take care of your mother. She needs her cross old Peggotty. I'll stay with her, although I hate these Murdstones. And remember, David, I love you as much as I love your mother, and more, and I'll write to you." "Thank you, dear Peggotty," I whispered back, tears rolling down my face. "Will you write to your brother too, and Ham, and little Emily, and tell them I'm not as bad as the Murdstones think, and send my love to them, especially little Emily?" Peggotty promised to do what I asked. The next morning, Miss Murdstone told me that because of my wickedness, I was going away to school. She had already packed my case for me. My mother was only allowed to say a very quick good-bye to me when the horse and cart arrived. The driver put my case on the cart, and we drove slowly out of Blunderstone. I was still sobbing loudly when suddenly I saw Peggotty running after us on the road. The driver stopped and waited for her. With difficulty, she climbed up onto the cart. "Here, Master David," she cried breathlessly. "A little present from me and your dear mother. Take care of yourself, my dear." She put a small purse and a paper bag into my hands, and held me so close to her fat body that I thought I would never breathe again. Then she jumped down and ran back along the road to the village. As we continued our journey, I dried my tears and looked at what she had given me. The bag was full of Peggotty's special cakes, and in the purse were 8 bright shilling coins. Thinking of my mother and Peggotty made me start crying again. But just then the driver, Mr. Barkis, began to talk to me. He was a large, red-faced man, who clearly found conversation difficult. "Did she make those cakes?" he asked slowly, having finished the one that I had offered him. "You mean Peggotty, sir?" "Yes. She does all our cooking." "Does she?" replied Mr. Barkis, with great interest. There was a long silence while he considered his next question. "Does she have a young man?" he asked. "You know, someone who wants to marry her." "Peggotty? A young man?" I repeated, surprised. "Oh, no. She's never had any young men." "Ah," replied Mr. Barkis, looking very pleased. Again, he thought for a long time before speaking. "Well," he said at last, "perhaps if you write to her—" "Will you be writing to her?" "You could give her a message from me. You could say, 'Barkis is willing.' Would you do that?" "Barkis is willing," I repeated innocently, wondering what the message meant. "Yes, of course. But you could tell her yourself, Mr. Barkis, when you return to Blunderstone tomorrow." No, he said. "No. You just give her the message. Remember, Barkis is willing." After this conversation, Mr. Barkis was completely silent for the rest of the journey. When we arrived in Yarmouth, I bought paper at the hotel and wrote this letter to Peggotty. My dear Peggotty, I have arrived safely in Yarmouth. Barkis is willing. Please give my love to Mother. Yours, David. P.S. He says it's important. Barkis is willing. In Yarmouth, I was put on the long-distance coach to London and travelled all through the night. At the coach station in London, I was collected by a teacher, Mr. Mell, and taken to Salem House, the school which the Murdstones had chosen for me. The school was a large old building with a dusty playground, surrounded by a high brick wall. It looked strangely deserted. I was very surprised to find that none of the boys were there, and was told that they were all on holiday, and that I had been sent there during the holidays as a punishment for my wickedness. The headmaster and teachers were on holiday too, all except for Mr. Mell, who had to look after me. I spent a whole month in that miserable place, doing my lessons in the dirty, empty classroom, which smelt of old food and unwashed boys. Every evening I had to eat my supper with Mr. Mell, and then go straight to bed. The worst thing was the sign I had to wear round my neck. It said, "Be careful, he bites." I was only allowed to take it off when I went to bed. Although I was extremely lonely and unhappy at this time, I was not looking forward to meeting all the other boys. I felt sure they would laugh at me, and especially at the sign I was forced to wear. But one day Mr. Mell told me that the headmaster, Mr. Creakle, had returned and wanted to see me. So I went, trembling, to his part of the house. I realized at once that Mr. Creakle lived much more comfortably than the boys or the teachers. He was a small, fat man with a purple nose, who was sitting in an armchair with a bottle and a glass in front of him.
"So this is the boy who bites, is it?" he asked unpleasantly. "I know your stepfather, boy. He's a man of strong character, he is. He knows me, and I know him. Do you know me? Answer me, boy!"
He pulled violently at my ear. "Not yet, sir," I answered, tears of pain in my eyes.
"Ah, but you soon will. Oh, yes, I have a strong character too, you'll see."
He banged his hand hard on the table. I was very frightened, but I made myself ask the question I had been considering for a whole month. "Please, sir, I am very sorry for what I did to Mr. Murdstone. Could I take this sign off before the other boys see it?" Mr. Creakle gave a sudden, terrible shout and jumped out of his chair. I did not wait to see whether he was going to hit me, but ran out of his room and hid in my bed for the next hour. However, the boys were not as cruel to me as I had feared. I made a friend almost immediately, a boy called Tommy Traddles, who was known to be the unluckiest boy in the school. I was also noticed, and even smiled on, by the great James Steerforth, one of the oldest boys, at least 6 years older than me. He was a handsome, intelligent, curly-haired young man who had become an important figure at the school, with great influence over the younger boys.
"How much money have you got, Copperfield?" he asked me.
8 shillings, Steerforth, I answered, remembering the present my mother and Peggotty had given me.
"You'd better give it to me. I'll take care of it for you,"
he offered in a friendly way. I opened Peggotty's purse and turned it upside down into his hand.
"Perhaps you'd like to spend some of it now," he suggested, smiling. "A bottle of wine, a tin of biscuits, a few cakes, that sort of thing. I can go out whenever I like, so I can buy it for you."
"Yes, that's very kind of you," I said, although I was a little worried that all my money would disappear. When we went upstairs to bed, I realised that all my money had been spent, as 8 shillings worth of food and drink was laid out on my bed in the moonlight. Of course, I did not want to eat and drink it all by myself, so I invited Steerforth and the others to help themselves. The boys were very willing, and we spent a pleasant evening sitting on our beds, whispering to each other. I discovered that the boys all hated Salem House, which they considered one of the worst schools in the country. They especially hated Mr. Creakle, who was in the habit of beating them regularly with a heavy stick which he carried with him at all times. The only boy he dared not beat was Steerforth. I admired Steerforth even more when I heard this. When we were all too tired to stay awake, Steerforth got up to go.
"Good night, young Copperfield," he said,
putting a hand on my head.
"I'll take care of you."
"It's very kind of you," I replied gratefully.
"You haven't got a sister, have you?" he asked sleepily.
"No, I haven't," I answered.
"What a pity. If you had one, I'm sure she'd be a pretty, bright-eyed little girl. I would have liked to meet her."
I thought of him a lot that night, with his laughing, handsome face, and his careless, confident manner. I could never have imagined what a dark shadow he would throw over the lives of people who were dear to me. I stayed at Salem House for 3 more months. Although 1 or 2 of the teachers, like Mr. Mell, were kind to us boys and tried to teach us properly, we were too afraid of Mr. Creakle and his stick to concentrate on our studies. But Tommy Traddles and I cheered each other up if we were beaten, and I was lucky enough to be friendly with the great Steerforth, in spite of the difference in our ages. However, my home, even with the Murdstones there, seemed a much pleasanter place than school, and I was glad when the Christmas holidays arrived, and I was allowed to return to Blunderstone. I was a little surprised to find that my mother had a new baby, and I could see at once that she was not well. She looked tired and worried, and very thin. But she and Peggotty were delighted to see me, although they dared not show it if the Murdstones were present. My stepfather and his sister seemed to hate me even more than before, if that were possible, and they made my life quite miserable whenever they could. In fact, I was almost pleased when it was time to return to school and see Traddles and Steerforth again. As the cart drove away, I remember my mother standing outside our house, with her baby in her arms, smiling sadly at me. That was the last time I saw her, and that is how I shall always remember her. Chapter 3. David the Orphan. Life went on as normal for me at school until my birthday 2 months later in March. I remember that day very well. It was cold, icy weather, and we boys had to blow on our fingers and rub our hands to keep warm in the freezing classrooms. When a message came for me to go and see Mr. Creakle, I thought that Peggotty must have sent me a birthday present, and so I hurried gladly along to his room. But there I realized something unusual had happened, because it was Mr. Creakle's wife who was waiting to speak to me.
"David, my child,"
she said kindly, holding my hand,
"we all have to accept that our loved ones can die at any moment."
I looked at her, trying to understand what she meant.
"I'm sorry to tell you," she continued, "that your mother is dangerously ill."
There was a mist in front of my eyes, and suddenly burning tears ran down my face. I knew the truth.
"Your mother is dead," she said.
I was already sobbing loudly, and I felt I was an orphan, quite alone in the world. Mrs. Creakle packed my case herself, and sent me home on the coach for the funeral. I did not realize at the time that I would never return to Salem House. When I arrived home, Peggotty met me at the door, and we cried miserably in each other's arms. Mr. Murdstone seemed very sad, and did not speak to me at all. Miss Murdstone, however, showed her usual firmness of character, which she and her brother were so proud of, by checking that I had brought all my clothes back from school. After that, she showed no interest in me at all. There was a deathly stillness in the house. Peggotty took me up to the room where my dear mother's dead body lay, with my little brother, who had died a few hours after her. Everything was fresh and clean in the room, but I could not look at my mother's lovely face, which would never smile at me again, without crying. "How did it happen, Peggotty?" I asked, sobbing. "She was ill for a long time, Master David. She got worse after the baby was born, you see. She was sometimes unhappy and forgetful, but she was always the same to me, her old Peggotty. Those two downstairs often spoke crossly to her and made her sad. But she still loved them, you know. She was so sweet and loving. I always sat beside her while she went to sleep. It made her feel better, she said." There was a short silence while Peggotty dried her eyes, then took both my hands in hers. "On the last night, she asked me for some water, and then gave me such a patient smile. She looked so beautiful. The sun was beginning to rise, and she put her head on my arm, on her stupid, cross old Peggotty's arm, and died like an innocent child going to sleep." After my mother's funeral, I began to wonder what would happen to me. The Murdstones did not even seem to notice that I was in the house. They had told Peggotty to leave, as they did not want her as their servant any more. So Peggotty was going to her brother's in Yarmouth, until she decided what work to do next. She suggested taking me with her for a holiday, and to my surprise, the Murdstones agreed. So, next morning, Mr. Barkis appeared at the door with his cart, and Peggotty's cases were put on it. We climbed up and sat beside him. Peggotty was naturally a little sad to leave her old home, where she had been so happy with my mother and me, and at first she cried a little. But when Mr. Barkis saw her drying her eyes and looking more cheerful, he too began to look happier, and he whispered to me, "Barkis is willing. You told her that?" Aloud he said to Peggotty, "Are you comfortable?" Peggotty laughed and said that she was. "And are you comfortable, Master David?" he asked. I said that I was. Mr. Barkis was so pleased with this conversation that he repeated it many times during the journey, and Peggotty and I both had to keep giving him the same answer. When we arrived in Yarmouth and got down from the cart, we said good-bye to Mr. Barkis. Daniel and Ham Peggotty were waiting for us. Daniel and Ham were exactly the same as I remembered them, cheerful and generous as ever. But little Emily seemed different somehow. She was taller and prettier, but she did not want to play with me or spend her time with me. I was rather disappointed, because I still considered she was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen, and I thought I was in love with her. Daniel and Ham were very proud of her intelligence and beauty, and just smiled when she laughingly refused to sit next to me. But they all listened with interest to my stories of school life at Salem House. I told them about the other boys, especially the handsome, clever Steerforth. I admired him so much that I could not stop myself telling them all about him. Suddenly, I noticed that Emily was listening eagerly, her blue eyes shining, and a smile on her lips. She blushed when she saw that we were all looking at her, and hid her face behind her hands. "Emily's like me," said Peggotty kindly, "and would like to see David's friend, Mr. Steerforth." The days passed happily, although Emily and I did not play together, as we had done before. Mr. Barkis was a frequent visitor, and soon Peggotty explained to me that she had decided to marry him. "I love you just as much, David, my dear, when I'm married," she told me, holding me close to her, "and I'll be able to come and see you in the cart any time I like. Barkis is a good man, and I'm sure I'll be happy with him. He's got a nice little house, and I'll keep a little bedroom there for you to use whenever you want. You'll always be welcome to come and stay." So, when I returned to Blunderstone, Peggotty had become Mrs. Barkis, and I was glad to think of her in her own house, with a husband to take care of her. At home, my stepfather and his sister did not seem pleased to see me, and were clearly trying to find a way of getting rid of me. As they considered school too expensive, they finally arranged for me to start work, although I was still only 10 years old, and very small for my age. I was sent to London, to work in a warehouse in the east of the city, near the river. My job was to wash bottles, which would then be filled with wine, or to pack the filled bottles in cases. I was paid only 6 shillings a week. There were several other boys who worked with me, but I was the only one who had been to school. All the warehouse workers were coarse, rough people, who were used to working in dirty conditions for long hours. No words can describe the horror I felt when I realized what my life was going to be like from now on. I was deeply ashamed at having such a job, and I was also afraid that I would forget everything I had learnt from my mother and my teachers. I would never find friends like Traddles or Steerforth, or be able to get a better position in life. It was an extremely unhappy time for me. My stepfather had asked Mr. Quinion, the manager, to find me somewhere to stay in London. So, at the end of my first day, I was called to Mr. Quinion's office and introduced to an important-looking, rather fat, middle-aged man with a head as bald as an egg. His name was Mr. Micawber, and he offered me a spare room in the house he was renting with his family. I agreed to take it, and Mr. Micawber and I walked home together. The Micawbers were obviously very poor, but tried hard not to let this show. The house had several floors of rather dirty, empty rooms with very little furniture. Mrs. Micawber was a thin, tired-looking woman with a baby in her arms. The baby was one of twins, and in all my experience of the family, I never saw Mrs. Micawber without at least one of the twins. They also had a 4-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter. Their only servant was a young orphan girl. "I never thought," Mrs. Micawber told me sadly as she showed me my room, "when I lived with mother and father, before I was married, that I would ever be as poor as this. But as Mr. Micawber is for the moment in difficulties, I must of course accept the situation. I'm afraid he owes a lot of money, but his creditors will just have to wait. You can't get blood out of a stone, nor can anyone get any money at all out of Mr. Micawber at present." I soon realised that neither Mr. nor Mrs. Micawber had ever been able to manage money. The little that Mr. Micawber earned was not enough either to keep his creditors happy or to pay for the needs of his growing family. So his creditors were constantly at the door, demanding payment, and meals were rather irregular in the Micawber house. Mr. and Mrs. Micawber's moods varied according to the situation. One moment Mr. Micawber looked extremely miserable and depressed. The next he was brushing his shoes and singing a song before going out. Mrs. Micawber's character was similar to her husband's. Sometimes I came home to find her lying on the floor, with her hair undone, looking wild and desperate. But an hour later she was cheerfully eating a good supper. I lived with these kind people for several months, and became very fond of them. I bought my own food out of my wages, because I knew the Micawbers hardly ever had enough for themselves, and I lived mostly on bread and cheese. As they were so short of money, once or twice I offered to lend them a few shillings, which they refused to accept. But at last Mr. Micawber's creditors became tired of waiting for their money and went to the police, who arrested him for debt. He was taken to the King's prison and asked me to visit him there. When I arrived, I was shown to his room, where he was waiting for me. He seemed quite broken-hearted, and even cried a little. "This is a black day for me, Copperfield," he sobbed. "I hope my mistakes will be a warning to young people like you. Remember, if a man earns £20 a year and spends £19 and 19 shillings, the result is happiness. But if he spends £20 and 1 shilling, the result is misery. By the way, Copperfield, could you lend me a shilling for some beer? Mrs. Micawber will pay you back as soon as you arrive home." And when the beer arrived, he appeared much more cheerful. We had a pleasant evening, telling stories and jokes. He stayed in prison for several weeks, and I visited him regularly. I was delighted to hear on one of my visits that he would soon be free, as his creditors had unwillingly accepted the fact that he had no way of paying his debts. I gave the news to Mrs. Micawber when I returned home. We celebrated by sharing our supper and a glass of wine together. "May I ask what you will do, madam, when Mr. Micawber is free?" I asked politely. "My family," said Mrs. Micawber grandly, "believe that Mr. Micawber should move to the country, to Devon, and carry on his business interests there. Mr. Micawber is a very clever man, Master Copperfield." "I'm sure he is," I agreed. "Although they haven't found anything exactly right for him yet, my family think he should be ready in Devon in case something turns up." She put down her empty glass. "And will you be going with him, madam?" I asked. "I must! I will!" Mrs. Micawber's voice rose to a scream. "He is my life, my love, my husband, the father of my children. I will never desert Mr. Micawber. You can't ask me to desert him." I felt very uncomfortable, as I had not asked her to desert him at all. But she soon became calm again, and finished her supper. I was becoming used to the Micawbers' changes of mood. I now realised that when the Micawbers left London, as they were planning to do, I would be very lonely in the city. I still hated my work in the warehouse, and wanted to make a better life for myself. I thought about it for a long time, and decided there was only one thing I could do. I would try to find my one surviving relation, my father's aunt, Miss Betsey Trotwood, and ask her to help me. I knew that she lived somewhere near Dover, in Kent. I could go there by coach, because Peggotty had once sent me 10 shillings to keep, in case I ever needed it. The time had come to use that money. Chapter 4. David and his Aunt. So, after helping the Micawbers to pack their few clothes, and waving goodbye to them at the coach station on their way to Devon, I went to the warehouse for my last day at work. I did not tell anyone I would not be coming back the following week. In the evening I packed my case, and put the 10 shillings in the little purse Peggotty had once given me. I looked around for someone to help me with my case, which was rather heavy for me, and saw a tall young man with a horse and cart passing by. "Could you please take my case to the coach station?" I asked him politely. The young man put the case into his cart. Then, looking round quickly to make sure there were no witnesses, he pushed me roughly against the wall and took my purse out of my trembling hand. Before I could say a word, he had driven the horse and cart down the road and out of sight round the corner. I knew I would never see him, my case, or my 10 shillings again. I sat down on the pavement and cried. Now I had lost everything I owned in the world, and had no money for the coach fare to Dover. In the end, I decided I would have to walk there, and I started the long journey. It took me 6 days to cover the 100 kilometres, as I got tired very easily and had to rest. I sold my jacket for 1 shilling, so that I could buy bread and milk on the way, and at night I slept in disused farm buildings or under trees. Sometimes I was afraid of the dangerous-looking beggars and thieves I met on the road, but I knew I had to keep going. As I walked, I thought of my mother's gentle, pretty face. I felt sure she would approve of what I was doing, and that encouraged me to continue. But when I arrived in Dover, it seemed a much larger town than I had imagined. I spent a whole morning asking people if they knew where Miss Betsey Trotwood lived. Finally, I found someone who recognised the name, and showed me the way to her house. I stood at her front door in the neat little garden for a few moments, trembling with fear, and wondering what my aunt would think of me. My face and hands were dirty. My hair was unbrushed, and my clothes were torn and dusty. Perhaps she wouldn't even want to invite me into her house. Just then, a handsome but strict-looking grey-haired woman came out of the door towards me. I knew she must be my aunt. "Go away," she said crossly. "I don't allow anyone to walk on my grass." "Please, madam," I said bravely. "Please, aunt." "What?" cried Miss Betsey in great surprise. please, Aunt, I'm your nephew."
"Good heavens!" she cried,
and sat down rather suddenly on the grass. "I'm David Copperfield, your nephew's son of Blunderstone in Suffolk, where you came on the night I was born, and saw my dear mother. I've been very unhappy since she died. My stepfather sent me to work in London, and I hated it and ran away, and someone stole my case and my money, and I've had to walk all the way, and I haven't slept in a bed for 6 nights." Here my self-control broke, and I fell to the ground, sobbing bitterly. My aunt jumped to her feet, picked me up, and took me into her sitting-room, where she mixed some medicine in a glass and made me drink it. She also wrapped me in a large blanket and put me on her sofa. Then she rang the bell for her servant, Janet.
"Please ask Mr. Dick to come here, Janet," she said.
A tall, grey-haired, pleasant-looking gentleman entered a few minutes later, laughing rather strangely to himself.
"Now, Mr. Dick," said my aunt firmly, "don't be a fool, because we all know you're intelligent."
Mr. Dick looked very serious at once.
"No doubt you remember that I had a nephew, David Copperfield? Well, this is his son. He has run away."
"Oh, really? David's son? Run away? Well," said Mr. Dick.
"Now, the question is, Mr. Dick, what shall I do with him?"
"Well," Mr. Dick looked vacantly at me, and then suddenly his eyes shone. "If I were you, I would wash him."
"Well done, Mr. Dick. You always have the right answer,"
said my aunt delightedly. And so they washed me, and gave me clean clothes and delicious food. While I was eating, my aunt stared at me, occasionally whispering, "Good heavens," to herself. When she could see that I felt better, she asked me question after question, and I told her the story of my life.
"Good heavens," she said again when I had finished. "Why did your poor mother marry again? What a terrible mistake!"
"Perhaps she was in love," suggested Mr. Dick, smiling his rather foolish smile.
"In love?" said Miss Betsey crossly. "Perhaps the poor silly girl thought she was in love. But now, Mr. Dick, another question. What should we do with the boy?"
"Well," said Mr. Dick, thinking. Then an idea suddenly came to him. "You should put him to bed."
"Thank you again, Mr. Dick, for your common sense," said my aunt happily. "Janet, put the boy to bed."
And so, in a comfortable, clean little bed, in a pleasant, airy room at the top of Miss Betsey Trotwood's house, I floated away into the world of my dreams. At breakfast next morning, I bravely asked my aunt, What's going to happen to me?"
"I've written to your stepfather," she replied.
"Oh, are you going to send me back to the Murdstones? Please don't, Aunt. Please let me stay here," I cried, trembling.
"I don't know what I'll do yet. We'll have to wait and see," she answered firmly.
This news made me very depressed, but there was nothing I could do about it, and my aunt soon began to talk about something else.
"What do you think of Mr. Dick, child?"
"He looks a little, well, mad. Is he mad, Aunt?"
"Well, his family called him mad and wanted to lock him up forever. But I met him and thought, I still think, he's an extremely sensible, intelligent person. So I offered to take care of him, and he's lived in my house for 10 years. Nobody knows what useful advice he's given me. I trust him completely."
When I heard how generous my aunt had been to poor, harmless Mr. Dick, I began to understand her character better. In spite of her stern appearance and frequent crossness, she was very kind to people who needed her help. I hoped she would be kind to me. Several days later, I was looking out of the sitting-room window when I saw Mr. and Miss Murdstone riding into my aunt's garden. My aunt had seen them too, and hurried out, waving her umbrella angrily at them and shouting, "Go away! Don't ride on my grass! Who do you think you are? Go away, I tell you!" "Aunt," I cried out, "they're Mr. and Miss Murdstone." "I don't care," she shouted. "Nobody is allowed to ride on my grass." And she went back into her house, banging the door behind her. The Murdstones had to lead their horses out of the garden and then return to ring the doorbell. They looked very uncomfortable and unsure of themselves. Janet showed them into the sitting-room, where my aunt, Mr. Dick, and I were waiting. "Miss Trotwood," began Mr. Murdstone, stepping forward. "Excuse me," said my aunt sharply. "I imagine you are the Mr. Murdstone who married my nephew's widow. In my opinion, it would have been much better if you had never married the poor child." "I agree with you, Miss Trotwood," said Miss Murdstone, smiling falsely. "My brother would certainly have been happier if he hadn't married her, because I consider poor dear Clara was, in fact, just a child." "Fortunately," said my aunt, "you and I, madam, are too old and plain for anyone to say that about us." Miss Murdstone did not seem eager to agree to this. Her brother, however, wanted to get down to business. "Miss Trotwood," he said a little crossly, "having received your letter, I've come to explain to you, in case you haven't realized it yet, that this boy is extremely wicked and violent. Both my sister and I have tried to change his character, but sadly we have failed." "I must add," said Miss Murdstone, "that of all the boys in the world, I believe this is the worst boy." "I see," said my aunt. "Now tell me, has David inherited any money from his father or mother?" "No, madam," answered Mr. Murdstone. "My dear Clara naturally trusted me to take care of David, and I'm ready to do that if he comes back with me now. But I alone shall decide what to do with him, Miss Trotwood. Understand that. I am here for the first and last time to take him away. If you decide to keep him with you, you keep him forever." "What do you say, David?" asked my aunt, turning to me. "Please don't let me go with them, Aunt," I begged. "They've always been unkind to me, and they made my mother very unhappy. I'll be so miserable if I have to go back with them." "What do you think, Mr. Dick?" asked my aunt. Mr. Dick thought for a moment. "Get a suit of clothes made for him immediately," he said. "What would I do without you, Mr. Dick?" asked my aunt, shaking his hand enthusiastically. Then she turned to Mr. Murdstone. "You'd better go. I'll keep the boy and take my chance with him." "I don't believe a word of your story. Do you think I don't know how you broke that poor girl's heart, and how you hated her son and punished him for it? I can see by your face that I'm right." We all stared at Mr. Murdstone. It was true that his face was white, and he was breathing fast. "Goodbye, sir, and goodbye to you too, madam," added my aunt, turning suddenly to Miss Murdstone. "If I see you riding on my grass again, I'll knock your hat right off your head." The Murdstone said nothing in reply to these fierce words, but walked quickly out of the house. Thank you, Aunt," I cried. "I'll do my best to make you proud of me." And I kissed her many times. "Mr. Dick, you and I will adopt this boy together," said my aunt, her stern expression softening into a smile. And so a new life began for me. I was soon able to forget the warehouse and the Murdstones in learning to please my aunt and to play games with Mr. Dick, who spent much of his time with me. But one day my aunt suggested that I should go to boarding school in Canterbury. I was delighted, as I was eager to continue my studies, and Canterbury was very near my aunt's home in Dover. So the next day my aunt and I went to Canterbury, where I admired the beautiful old buildings in the ancient city centre. "Is it a large school, Aunt?" I asked politely.
"I haven't decided which school you'll go to yet," she replied. "First, we're going to ask my old friend Mr. Wickfield's advice about it. He lives and works in Canterbury, you see."
Soon we stopped in front of a very old house, with a very clean front doorstep and fresh white curtains at the windows. A strange-looking person, dressed in black, with short red hair and a very thin white face, came out to meet us. I thought he must be a servant. He was about 15, but looked much older.
"Is Mr. Wickfield at home, Uriah Heep?" asked my aunt.
"He is, madam," replied Uriah, smiling unpleasantly. He showed us into the sitting-room, where I noticed 2 large paintings on the wall, one of a grey-haired gentleman, the other of a lady with a sweet, gentle face. Just then a gentleman entered the room, looking a little older than his picture. I soon discovered he was Mr. Wickfield, my aunt's lawyer.
"Mr. Wickfield," said my aunt, "this is my nephew. I have adopted him, and I want to send him to a good boarding school here in Canterbury. Can you help me find a school for him?"
Mr. Wickfield thought for a moment.
"There's a very good school I can recommend, Dr. Strong's, but the boy can't board there, and it's too far to travel from Dover every day. However, he could live here, if you liked, in my house. There's plenty of room for him." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Wickfield. I'll pay you for his food, of course," said my aunt. "Come and meet Agnes, who takes care of everything and manages the house," said Mr. Wickfield.
We all went upstairs to another sitting-room, prettily furnished, where a girl of my own age was sitting. On her face I saw immediately the beautiful, calm expression of the lady in the painting downstairs, and I knew she must be Mr. Wickfield's daughter, Agnes. When I saw the way Mr. Wickfield looked at Agnes and held her hand, I realized that she was the only thing that made life worth living for him. The lady in the painting was her mother, who had died some years before, and Agnes was now in complete charge of the house. She welcomed me warmly as a guest, and showed me the comfortable bedroom I would sleep in. My aunt was very happy to leave me in the care of Mr. Wickfield and his daughter.
"I must leave now, David," she told me. "Mr. Wickfield will take you to school tomorrow and make all the arrangements. I'm sure you will work hard and do well."
"Thank you, Aunt," I said, trying not to cry. "And give my love to Mr. Dick. And thank you again." When she had gone, I dried my tears, and spent a pleasant evening with the Wickfields. We ate supper and talked in the pretty little sitting-room. Agnes played the piano and tried to amuse her father, but he often looked serious and rather sad. During the evening he drank a good deal of wine. I wondered why he seemed unhappy. The next day I had my first experience of a well-organised school. It could not have been more different from Salem House. The headmaster, Dr. Strong, was a gentle, kind man, who enjoyed teaching and never punished anybody. I soon made friends with the other boys, and as time went on, with the teachers too. But although I liked school very much, I was always happy to return to the Wickfields' quiet house every evening. There Agnes used to help me with my studies, and listen sympathetically to my problems, and her father always seemed pleased to see me. I often wrote to my aunt and Peggotty, and Mr. Dick came to visit me once a week. The strangest person in my new life was Uriah Heep. Soon after I arrived in Canterbury, we had a conversation one evening. He was doing a lot of Mr. Wickfield's work, and was working late in his small office just off the hall of the Wickfields' house.
Come in, Master Copperfield," he cried, when he saw me passing the door.
I entered, and found him reading a large dusty book, and making careful notes in a notebook. "What are you studying, Uriah?" I asked politely.
"I'm going to be a lawyer," he replied, rubbing his thin hands together and smiling his oily smile.
"You're Mr. Wickfield's assistant, aren't you? Perhaps one day you'll be his partner," I said, trying to make conversation.
"Oh, no, Master Copperfield,"
cried Uriah, rolling his eyes upwards.
"I could never rise so high. No, I'm much too humble for that. But thank you, Master Copperfield, for thinking kindly of me. And may I say that if ever you have the time, and I'm sure a young gentleman like you is much too busy to spare the time for a poor person like me, my mother and I would be glad to offer you a cup of tea at our humble home."
"Of course, if I have time," I answered, and left the room quickly. I did not feel comfortable with him for some reason. But the following week he invited me to tea again, and I did not want to appear rude, so I agreed. That evening he and I walked to the small house where he lived with his mother. It was a warm day, and we were drinking our tea near the open door, when a gentleman I recognized passed by. It was Mr. Micawber. He saw me sitting near the door, and called out,
"Copperfield! Is it really you?"
I was delighted to see him again, and Mrs. Heep invited him in for some tea. I had to introduce him to the Heeps, but I did not think that Uriah would be a good influence on Mr. Micawber. However, I was interested to discover that the Micawbers were now living in Canterbury, as nothing had turned up in Devon. They seemed to be very short of money again, and surrounded by creditors as usual. I left the Heeps' house as soon as possible, taking Mr. Micawber with me, as I did not want him to tell Uriah all about my life at the warehouse in London. And so the years passed. I learnt everything that Dr. Strong and his teachers could teach me, and at 17 came to the end of my schooldays. My aunt suggested that, before deciding what profession to choose, I should spend a month in London, or travelling round the country. This would give me time to consider my next step. I agreed enthusiastically, and although I was sorry to say good-bye to my sweet friend Agnes and her father, I was looking forward to leading the life of an independent young gentleman.